All right, and we are live. Welcome to the channel. In today's video, I want to talk about why my first truck was a GMC Sierra and not a Ford. So 2012, 2013, I was in the market for a new truck. At the time, I was working at Ford. I had about a year in the company, and the EcoBoost was really popular at the time. It was a new thing at the time. I believe they were on the first gen. And to be honest, uh, I just wasn't a believer in EcoBoost at the time. This is before the 2.7 was out. It was the first gen EcoBoost. You're talking 365 horsepower, 420 foot-pounds of torque. And I was working at Ford on the line building the F-150. But, you know, before that, before looking for a truck, I was working on cars. I was in the field working on cars on the side. I worked on Chevys, Fords, mostly domestic vehicles, and thinking about what truck I wanted. I wanted something affordable. I wanted to get something a little bit older because at the time I was like 22 years old, and I wanted to get something that I could afford. And looking at the Ford products, there was an opportunity to get a 6-liter diesel. The 6.0 diesel, those were really cheap at the time because there were so many issues with that engine. And that was a big value proposition for me because there were so many of those on the market for like 10 grand. And, I felt like being in a situation where I could work on cars or work on trucks, that would have been a good proposition for me, just because I can get a vehicle for a cheaper price, have a good truck, a good full-size truck, and also have a very good engine. I mean, once you worked out all the bugs with the 6-liter V8 turbo diesel, that was a really good engine, fast, good power, good torque, good everything. It was a great engine once you worked out all the bugs. I actually had a few friends who had the 6-liter turbo diesel. I mean, yeah, they had their issues. They were always kind of wrenching on them. But aside from that, when they were running good, they were great trucks. So that was an option. But then also, too, I had to look at the, I was also looking at the 6-liter Vortec gas V8. And I was drawn to the 6-liter because in GM products, there was a lot of 6-liters that had a lot of power. The 6-liter GTO engine was an aluminum engine, but it was very similar to the truck engine. It had 400 horsepower and 400 foot-pounds of torque, and those numbers are even impressive in today's standards. I mean, if you look at the 5.0 V8 that Ford makes now, 400 horsepower, I mean, 400 foot-pounds of torque, 400 horsepower, that's pretty close to what the 5.0 makes now. The 5.0, I think now in the truck is going to be like 400 horsepower, and it's going to be very close, actually. I don't know the exact numbers on the 5.0 off the top of my head on an F-150. I know in a Mustang, the 5.0 is like 420 horsepower, and I don't know the exact torque numbers right now either, but I know they're up there. But it was interesting because the 6-liter Vortec from like '04 had 400 horsepower, 400 foot-pounds of torque. So, and it was just a push-rod V8. It was a very simple engine compared to even like the 5.0. It will be incredibly simple, easy to work on, reliable. But the reason I was looking at the Sierra is because it had that 6-liter engine. It was a very similar engine. You could probably even get the GMC 6-liter engine up to those power numbers. But when you were to get a GMC 6-liter in a Sierra, which was what I was looking for, you were limited to about 300 horsepower, 300 foot-pounds of torque. It was iron engine versus aluminum. It had a little bit less compression, a different intake, but essentially you could bolt that engine into the Sierra. You could bolt the 400 horsepower one, or I think the reason that it only had 300 horsepower is because of the tuning and some other minor tweaks. And the block was actually iron versus aluminum, but aside from that, they were very similar engines. So the value of the 6.0 was also very intriguing to me at the time, being my first truck purchase. And the 6.0, was extremely reliable, and those trucks held a ton of value because they were so reliable. Versus the Fords, you could get a nice Ford for like 10 grand, but you knew you had to work on it. Even a diesel, you can get a nice diesel Ford for like 10 or 12 grand at the time, and you knew, you had to work on it. I think even now, the 6-liter diesel Power Stroke engines, they've maybe even gone up in value a little bit because people now know the issues. I think at the time when I was looking, it was more of a mystery what you were going to get. But I think people now have more workarounds and fixes for the 6-liter Power Stroke. But long story short, I ended up going with the 6-liter Vortec V8. I ended up with a real nice GMC Sierra. It had quadra-steer, so it had 4-wheel steering. It was a crew cab. It was fully loaded. It had leather, heated seats, Bose sound. Really nice truck. And I drove that thing for like 60,000 miles. Had it for a couple years. It was a good truck, and I had no issues no major issues. Very minor. I think like a water pump or something at one point. But one of the big factors that kind of leaned me in that direction was the independent front suspension. At the time, I felt like the independent front suspension was way more superior than the solid axle that you got with the F-Series, F-250s, F-350s, and Dodges, because it was newer technology. Solid axles were more like, in my opinion at the time, were more like from the past. And, it was more like cutting edge to have the independent front suspension. And it was known that it went down the road a little better and took bumps a little better. But I never really considered how much weight it could carry off the front end, which would have been terrible. At the time, I wasn't plowing snow, and I couldn't get very much of any kind of plow with that truck. But aside from carrying a load, that was a really good front end. But it really makes me wonder. At the time, Ford, when you're thinking about 04, 05, if you're getting an older truck, I don't know if Ford necessarily had a better product. GMC's, everything was all electric. When you open the hood, all the sensors, all the wiring, everything was all electric. Versus Fords, they had so many vacuum controlled modules. It was just, working on that thing would have been a nightmare. Working on a Chevy, most of the time you could just pull a code and somewhat track down an issue, where with the Fords it was like vacuum lines, finding vacuum leaks and weird stuff like that. Ford just actually went like all electronic for the F-150 back in like 18. And I think with the GMCs, that would have been back in like year 2000, where everything would have been all electronic, which is really kind of interesting because Ford had like the more cutting edge engines on paper. On paper, they had the dual overhead cams. They had the, stuff like that, dual overhead cams, whatever, better, you could say, more valves per cylinder type of thing, where the GMCs always had the push rod V8s, old school technology, the small block V8s, yet everything else on the engine was all electronics. So they had better electronics, but not as new or advanced engines. Even their V6s were push rod V6 engines at the time. Well, ended up with that Sierra. It was a good truck, but being at Ford a number of more years, I did finally try out an EcoBoost. It actually came down to the point where, I actually was working overtime and ended up driving the trucks. Just parking them, at the plant. When you're building these trucks, somebody's got to drive the trucks, and like after they're built, they got to park them and everything on the over in Dearborn truck plant. And I was driving these around, and it was actually 2015 when the first 2.7 liter EcoBoost came out. And I just remember just like getting into the open road in the plant and just flooring them just to see how fast they would go, hopefully not getting caught by the authorities in the plant. But it was just I was blown away by the power of the EcoBoost. The 2.7 was so powerful, so fast, and it was just like stunning that a truck could be that fast. As great as the 6-liter Vortec was, which is what I was driving at the time, it was not fast at all. It was a very, you know, slow truck compared to what the EcoBoost can do. And you know, after that, I had to look into how much they cost and how I can get one. And I ended up leasing one for like $300 a month. It was my silver 2.7, the first truck that I had on the channel, and it was a great truck. It was fast. I had a ton of fun with it, and got a lot of views from the videos that I filmed with it. And after that, I ended up go ahead and getting the 3.5 EcoBoost, and now my wife's got her own 2.7 EcoBoost. So the GMC was a great truck, but I wonder if I wasn't at Ford, would I ever go back to the GMC for a heavy duty truck? Like if I were to leave Ford, would I still stay with the 250? GM's doing a lot of interesting stuff right now. They're coming out with, I think, a better lineup of engines. You know, Ford's coming out with a new 7.3 liter V8, but they're not doing dual injection. They're not giving it direct injection along with port injection. And I mean, if I were in charge of Ford, I would just go ahead and come out with a better version of the 6.2, which is what GM's doing. They're coming out with a better version of the 6.0. They're giving it dual injection. So it's going to have direct injection, and it's going to have port injection. So, you know, if you wanted to get away from the diesels, which a lot of people are trying to get away from the diesels, you could get that engine, and now you can, you know, if it had direct injection from factory, you could add a power adder and get so much more power than you can get from a non-direct inject engine. Direct injection adds a ton of potential to the engine. You can get, you know, 700 horsepower once the engine's direct injected. So that's going to be interesting. And then I also wonder if the independent front suspension is better over the long run. You know, I think solid axle is probably better for the long term. But the way I use trucks, I mean, I get them pretty much new, and I don't have them up into the higher mileage anyway. But the independent front suspension on the GMC is more serviceable in my opinion. I mean, if you were to potentially have a hub problem, you could change out that hub fairly easily compared to a Ford. I mean, these hub bearings on Fords are not easy to service. I've done them before, and they're brutal compared to a Chevy. I mean, you take off on the Chevy, you just take off the axle nut and you go behind the wheel, take off the bolts, take off the hub bearing, boom, put in a new one. And, you know, also when you get the Chevy, you get the ability to have automatic four-wheel drive compared to the Ford. I mean, they say you can shift on the fly, but I gotta stop. You know, I've tried shifting on the fly, and it makes a grinding noise. So I stop all the time when I put it in four-wheel drive. The Chevy, you can throw that thing in four-wheel drive at any speed. I will say the Ford has a better angle. It has a tighter turning radius because of the independent front suspension. You know, the thing really cuts hard. I feel like because of the solid axle, it cuts harder. I feel like when they have the independent front suspension with those axle shafts going through the CV joints, I feel like there's some limitation with how tight they can turn. I know my Super Duty turns better and tighter than the F-150. And I think it has to do with the fact that the independent front suspension uses CV joints, and CV joints I don't think can hit the same angles that a Ford, like a solid axle, can hit. But yeah, first truck was a Chevy. I don't know if I'll ever go back. Maybe. You know, if I were working at Ford, I might consider it. You know, and they have a lot of good technology inside of them, and they do have a lot of pros. So I don't know. Maybe there'll be a GMC on the channel at some point. I think what they've done with the front end on the GMC is good. I mean, a lot of people say it don't look good, but I feel like they look really good. As does the Ford. The Fords look great too. I'm really curious of what's going to happen with the F-150. Are they going to change up the front end or what? You know, moving forward. I know they need a new instrument panel for sure. Blocked out. I don't know the code. Wish I did. But the wife's been enjoying her truck. I'm trying to get her to do a review for it, but she hasn't I don't know. She hasn't been interested in doing a review for her truck, but it's been great. I need to wash it. I'm nervous to wash her truck because of the black paint, but I will get around to it. I need to do something about these tires. They haven't been, whatever, armoralled or whatever. Let's see. Whoa. Look at this. Hey, you. They grow so fast. Anyway, guys, that's it for the video. Thank you for watching and have a great day.